the things that I love about fly fishing is the challenge of trying to figure out what type of flies you should be using. And so on this video, I want to talk a little bit about how do we make decisions about what flies to choose, and maybe even think about like when should you change flies. And so when it comes to fly fishing, most of the time we're trying to do what is called matching the hatch, which is simply trying to put flies on that are imitating the bugs that are in the river. But you might be on a fishery that doesn't necessarily have a huge bug population. Maybe you're fishing on a river that's got other different protein sources. And so on this video, we're going to talk about that. Okay, so obviously the first place to start out with is the bugs. If you happen to be on the river and you see a specific species, like there's a bunch of caddis that are coming off the river and you can see them fluttering around, or maybe mayflies, whether it's blue-wing olives or PMDs, you can obviously look at those and kind of get an estimate on the size and the color, and then you can, grab one of your boxes out and tie on some flies. Like I've got 2 boxes right here. This is my PMD box, and so I can open that up and you can kind of see right there. I think that'll focus. You can see all the different flies, and you can go in there and pick out one of the various PMD nymphs. I got the same thing for my Baetis patterns, a ton of different Baetis patterns, and so that's one way that you can change flies up. If you are using, for instance, a rubber legs and you have a Baetis pattern on, and then you start to see a bunch of caddis and PMDs flying around, it might be worth it, if you're not catching any fish, to change up to something that is imitating what is currently in the river. Now, if you're on one of the rivers I fish a lot, you might see a bunch of caddis and a bunch of a certain species, and you should not have that on because sometimes the fish do not follow the rules. Another consideration when it comes to changing flies happens to be in relation to depths. Obviously, if you're seeing surface activity and you're using nymphs underneath the surface, you would want to change up and put on a dry fly. So I've got this trusty dry fly box right here, one of my dry fly boxes, and you can open that up and you can imitate what you see flying around. There's probably about, 5 to 8 patterns that are kind of within the sphere of all the different types of dry flies that you can use. But that's one thing you can do if you're wanting to get down deeper. If you're Euro nymphing, tight lining, then obviously the patterns you're going to pick are going to be different than what you would be using if you're dry fly fishing, because they're going to have heavier heads on them, have more weight to them so they can get down quicker. So that's another thing to consider, is the methodology that you're using, the depth that you're fishing, and things like that. Now, I just got back from Alaska recently and had an opportunity to spend a few days fishing kind of where I grew up at. And one of the main questions that we ask ourselves up there is, what is in the water protein-wise? We have opportunities to use bug patterns up there. Rubber legs will work up there. There's certain stonefly patterns that'll work. There are caddis. In fact, when I was on the Kenai River, there were a gazillion caddis popping off one late afternoon. But the primary food source in a lot of those rivers happens to be protein, namely in the form of salmon flesh or salmon smolts or eggs. And so, you might be on the river at a time of the year in the spring where there's a lot of salmon smolt that are making their way back to the ocean. And so something like a Dalai Lama might be a really good option to put on, and that'll be all dependent on what's going on at that time. Later in the year, or actually oftentimes early in the year, flesh flies are really good. And so there's these patterns that we have that look like pieces of salmon flesh floating. And then you obviously have the infamous spherical Baetis or the circle caddis that you can use too, depending on if there are salmon eggs in the river at that particular time. Lastly, I want to talk a bit about what do you do when the fish do not seem to be participating. They're not eating the flies that you see floating around. You kind of are in the ballpark and you're just not getting eaten. In those cases, there are certain flies that a lot of guides and a lot of anglers will call attractor patterns that you can utilize, that are kind of like in the world of a specific bug type, but they're also, a lot of times they can be flies that just seem to be good at catching fish when they're not biting. There was a really popular fly on one of my fisheries a couple years ago called the Fire Starter, and it's literally just a piece of orange floss. It's the most ridiculous fly in the world. Well, that's not true. There's a lot of other ridiculous flies. But that pattern was really effective for a while. There's a lot of different attractor patterns you can use that are kind of similar to other bugs that might be in the river. I'm thinking of like certain, Euro flies that you can will get down low, and they look kind of similar to caddis patterns. Here's got a bunch of purple coloration on it, purple dart. But anyway, so that's another thing you can do. If you're not getting eats, you can definitely change up and try things that you haven't tried, because you don't know if you don't try. So yeah, there's a lot of different things that will influence the way that you choose flies. What you might start out with in the morning may be completely different than the evenings. In fact, on a lot of the fisheries that I guide on, you might start out in the morning with things like midges or certain types of mayflies. And then later on in the afternoon and evening, you might switch to a different type of mayfly, like a PMD, or you'll move over to caddis. And a lot of that is, again, determined by what you're seeing on the river, as well as what you maybe just have found through trial and error. And that's the cool thing about fly fishing, again, is that, you just got to try stuff. And if you don't try stuff, you won't know whether or not it works or it doesn't. There's a lot of flies that I have used over the years that when I tied them or when I purchased them, I was convinced they were going to be my new secret weapon, only to determine that I spent a lot of money on things that do not seem to catch fish. And then there's other flies that I just stumbled upon because I got lucky, that I now am always using, because they tend to work really, really well. So anyway, I hope that helps. And if you have any other questions, leave a comment below and we will do our best to answer those questions. And I'd love to know, what are some of the things that help you make decisions on how you're going to change flies? Let us know. We'll talk to you soon. Probably the number one way to figure out what they're biting on is to call somebody who's been on the river recently and ask them to tell you what flies they're eating. That's what I do every time I go fishing when I look for Matt Squillante. I call calling.